Traditional Christianity is predicated on the doctrine of the incarnation of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. As John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh. For Christians, this event marks the absolute pinnacle of their history and revelation. God so loved the world that he emptied himself and took on a human nature. I personally believe that this is indeed a powerful story. Nevertheless, is this story predicated on true doctrine? Is it logically coherent? Or is it instead a concept rife with paradox and logical contradiction that stretches the limits of credulity? Christianity is a religion of deep history and tradition, and that history and tradition goes no deeper than the doctrines of the Incarnation and the Hypostatic Union. The supposed event of Jesus as God entering the world and taking on a human nature forms the deepest root of Christian doctrine, one that is not easily jettisoned. But the concept has come under fire for centuries. Critics of the Incarnation make the claim that the concept is logically incoherent and contradictory. Criticisms take the form of arguing that a single being cannot harbor both divine and human attributes simultaneously, just as a being cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same respect. It's claimed that the essential divine attributes contradict the essential attributes that a human would harbor. God is metaphysically necessary, and man is contingent. God is omniscient, and man is limited in knowledge. God is immaterial or incorporeal, and man is made of matter. God is immortal, and man is mortal. These attributes or properties cannot coexist in the same person and in the same nature. Just as, for example, the essential properties of a square and the essential properties of a circle are mutually exclusive and cannot coexist in a single geometric shape with one distinct nature. There are no such things as square circles. However, Christian theologians would maintain that these criticisms, as articulated, are based on a caricature of Christian doctrine. The so-called logical contradictions inherent in the Incarnation arise only if one conflates personhood with nature. That is, if one believes that Jesus as one person held only one nature. Theologians tend to agree that if Jesus only had one nature, then these mutually exclusive attributes would indeed be manifest at the same time and in the same way with respect to Jesus and would lead to incoherence. Enter the Council of Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon was an ecumenical council of Christian bishops held in 451 CE in Chalcedon to address theological disputes about the nature of the incarnate Christ. This council wrestled specifically with the issues just articulated, and eventually came to promulgate the doctrine of the Incarnation as one person, Jesus, who subsisted in two separate natures. Jesus was fully God and fully man because he maintained two distinct natures, one divine nature and one human nature. This is the doctrine known as the Hypostatic Union. Thus, we see that arguing against the Incarnation on the grounds that mutually exclusive properties subsist in the same being with the same nature is not adequately addressing the doctrine as Christians would affirm it. It attacks a straw man. Nevertheless, despite this theological clarification, I don't think the doctrinal conception of the hypostatic union gets off that easy. For one thing, what does it even mean for anything, let alone Jesus, to have two natures? It doesn't seem to be an intuitively coherent concept. After all, to return to the aforementioned analogy regarding a square circle, does it seem to make the concept any less obscure and any more coherent to posit a single geometric figure with two natures? One nature being that of a circle and one nature being that of a square? Hardly. The concept remains incoherent and doesn't seem to derive any veracity by merely positing two distinct natures. But it gets worse. Not only is the assertion of one being with two natures vague and largely inconceivable, I would argue that it's not even metaphysically possible. let's take a detour into metaphysical speculation to see why I think we can confidently make such a claim. For what exactly is a nature in the first place? Well, the nature of a being is just the set of essential properties it harbors. Note that by the term being, I just mean anything that exists. Any being possesses properties. Some properties are accidental and some are essential. Essential properties are those properties that a being could not fail to have without failing to be the thing itself. Accidental properties are those properties that a being could fail to have and yet would still continue to be the thing that it is. Essential properties constitute a being's nature, while accidental properties do not. For example, a particular tree might harbor both the property of photosynthesis and the property of being deciduous. Yet being deciduous is not essential to being a tree, as trees can also be evergreens. Thus, the property of being deciduous is an accidental property and does not constitute part of the nature of being a tree. On the other hand, the property of photosynthesis is essential to all trees and thus is part of their nature. How exactly is all this pertinent to the argument against the hypostatic union? Well, if we take this concept of the incarnation at face value, we have one being or person, Jesus, subsisting in two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. If Jesus had two natures, this entails that Jesus has two sets of essential properties. Let's label these sets. We'll label Jesus' set of essential divine properties as set A, and we'll label his set of essential human properties as set B. Notice that since we're concerned with what constitutes these natures, we're necessarily concerned with the essential properties of both and not their accidental properties. Though, while there are accidental human properties, I don't believe there are any divine accidental properties. But I digress. We can populate these sets with their corresponding essential properties outlined earlier. Note that these properties are not meant to be exhaustive. There might be many more here that I'm not listing. They're merely properties that appropriately illustrate the point at hand. Now, here's where things get interesting. Notice that both sets are essential properties of one being, namely Jesus. This means that all properties in set A are essential to the incarnate Jesus, and all properties in set B are also essential to the incarnate Jesus. This entails that we don't need two sets of essential properties, but only one set, since both sets of essential properties satisfy the exact same condition or standard, namely of being essential properties of Jesus. That's what sets are, groups of elements that satisfy the same condition or standard. If both sets are essential properties of one being, then both sets satisfy the same condition, and we can even label this condition that both sets satisfy as set C. Thus, if both sets satisfy C, then only one set, set C, is needed to harbor all these essential properties. But remember, these sets of essential properties are what constitutes a nature. So once we merge these two sets into one, we end up with one nature, as opposed to the two we began with. Thus, this labyrinth of metaphysics demonstrates that having more than one nature is simply not possible for any being. Any being that supposedly has more than one nature will always have all their essential properties subsumed into one solitary set, and thus will always have at most one nature. The consequences this inference poses for the doctrine of the hypostatic union of Jesus should be obvious. This doctrine is simply not metaphysically possible. Even if we assume for the sake of argument the possibility of two natures subsisting in one being, namely the incarnate Jesus, those two natures logically subsume into one nature, contradicting the very premise that we assumed. This doctrine of the hypostatic union of Jesus leads to a reductio ad absurdum. Even worse, inferring that the two natures logically merge into one entails that the properties theologians were trying to avoid lumping into a single nature because of their mutual exclusivity end up being lumped together anyway. Thus, if Jesus was fully God and fully human, we still end up with the exact same logical problem that the Council of Chalcedon was attempting to circumvent. Namely, the essential properties of the incarnate Jesus will contradict each other and thus lead to a logical impossibility. When I was a Christian, I wrestled with this theological issue for a long time, to no avail. The doctrines of the Incarnation and the Hypostatic Union seem to be incoherent logical and metaphysical impossibilities. The only out for the Christian at this point is to appeal to mystery and faith. This is usually the tactic employed for the Trinity, as the Trinity seems to fall victim to the same charges of logical incoherence. Nevertheless, the Christian may always retreat to the assertion that because we are attempting to conceive of deep metaphysical truths of the divine, logic and understanding will evade us. For how can man probe the depths of the ineffable nature and ontological workings of God himself? While this avenue is understandable, it remains unconvincing. I agree that if God exists, the human discernment of the depths of his essence and nature will remain a largely mysterious endeavor. Nevertheless, this is different than actively promulgating a contradiction on the part of this essence or nature. That is to say, it's one thing to claim something is mysterious in and of itself, but it's a whole other thing entirely to unravel this mystery by promulgating doctrines that violate the known laws of logic and metaphysics. And this is the mistake Christians fall victim to. Attempting to unravel a mystery by positing a contradiction renders the mystery itself vacuous. So, it seems the Christian theologians' efforts are not efficacious. The Incarnation and the Hypostatic Union remain incoherent doctrines and concepts. So, it seems it's back to the drawing board for Christian theologians. Thanks for watching.